There's a moment in life where kindness turns from virtue into vulnerability, and most people don't even notice it happening. Because we're taught from childhood that being kind is always good, that compassion is the highest moral path, and that selflessness is a sign of maturity. But what if that idea is only half true? What if being too kind, too forgiving, too available actually destroys you? Not in one dramatic collapse, but in a slow erosion of your boundaries, your identity, and your sense of worth. I'm not saying kindness is wrong. I'm saying kindness without discernment becomes a mask. And that mask, while beautiful on the outside, hides a far more painful truth. That some of us are not kind because we want to be, but because we're terrified of what will happen if we're not. We believe that if we stop pleasing others, we'll be abandoned. That if we stop giving, we'll lose our value. That if we stop smiling, we'll be rejected. And that belief, that core, buried belief, is the hidden trap. Let's get brutally honest. How many times have you said yes when you meant no? How many times have you helped someone, not out of love, but out of obligation? How many times have you been there for people who would vanish the moment you needed them? More importantly, why did you keep doing it? That's the real philosophical dilemma. Because kindness, for many of us, isn't about generosity. It's about survival. It's about keeping the peace. It's about controlling how others see us so we feel safe. And that's not real kindness, it's fear dressed up as virtue. But no one teaches us this. No one tells us that the child who learns to be the good one often becomes the adult who forgets how to say I matter. And so we keep giving and giving and giving until we disappear, until the smile becomes a script, until the compassion becomes a cage, until we no longer know the difference between being good and being used.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
This is where philosophy meets psychology, because the ancient thinkers warned us about this. Aristotle spoke of the golden mean, the balance between extremes. He said that virtue lies not in excess but in moderation. Courage is the balance between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the balance between selfishness and self-sacrifice. But what happens when you never learn that balance? What happens when you only feel safe when you are overgiving, over-accommodating, over-apologizing? You begin to betray yourself in the name of empathy. You begin to abandon your needs in the name of love. You begin to mistake being liked for being respected. And when that becomes your pattern, your entire identity forms around being what others want rather than who you truly are. That's not kindness. That's self-erasure. And the consequences are devastating, because you start to attract people who expect you to betray yourself. People who don't see your kindness as a gift but as a resource, a tool, a supply. And the more you give, the more they take. Until one day, you hit a wall. You feel used, empty, resentful. But then guilt kicks in. You think, am I being selfish? Am I the problem? Maybe I should just keep the peace. And so the cycle continues. That's the hidden trap. It's not that people are always malicious, it's that you've trained them unconsciously to expect your silence, your compliance, your constant yes. And the moment you try to shift, to set a boundary, to finally say no, they start to push back. Not because you're wrong, but because they're losing access to a version of you that never should have existed in the first place. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Who would you be if you weren't afraid of disappointing people? What would you say? What would you say? What would you stop doing? Who would you stop chasing? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the doorway to freedom. Because true kindness doesn't come from fear. It comes from clarity, from strength, from knowing that your worth is not tied to how much you give, but how deeply you respect your own limits. And here's where your power begins. The moment you realize that saying no can be the most loving thing you do, not just for yourself, but for others. Because when you stop performing kindness, you start embodying truth. And there is nothing more powerful, more magnetic, and more real than a person who is kind not because they have to be, but because they choose to be, from a place of self-respect, not self-abandonment. Why self-sacrifice without boundaries destroys love? There's a dangerous illusion we carry, often without realizing it, that love is proven through sacrifice, that the more we give up our time, our energy, our needs, the more worthy we are of love in return. But what if that's a lie? What if the endless giving doesn't bring people closer, but instead pushes them away? You see, when you love without boundaries, when you give without limits, you don't just exhaust yourself, you confuse others. You teach them to expect what should be exceptional. You normalize the extraordinary until it becomes invisible. And slowly, the people you love stop seeing your kindness as a gift and start treating it like a given, not out of cruelty, but out of conditioning. And then, when you finally reach your breaking point, when you start to pull back, to speak up, to ask for something in return, it feels like betrayal. But not to you, to them, because the version of you they fell in love with wasn't real. It was a version you created to be loved at the cost of your soul. Here's the philosophical contradiction. We're told that love is selfless, but love without self is not love, it's erasure. The Stoics, who mastered the art of emotional clarity, believed that virtue is found not in pleasing others, but in living in alignment with nature, with your own nature. They taught that your first responsibility is to yourself. Not in a selfish way, but in a foundational one, because you cannot give what you do not possess. You cannot love others fully if you do not first honor yourself. And yet, how many of us were taught the opposite? That to be kind is to be quiet. That to be generous is to be invisible. That to be a good person is to never make others uncomfortable, even if that means living in constant discomfort ourselves. That's not virtue. That's a slow form of self-destruction disguised as love. And if we don't heal this, if we don't recognize the cost of this belief, we end up in relationships that drain us instead of nourish us. We become magnets for takers, for narcissists, for people who confuse our empathy for weakness and our forgiveness for permission. And worst of all, we begin to resent the very people we once loved. Not because they are inherently bad, but because we never gave them a chance to love the real us, the version with needs, with boundaries, with limits. We built intimacy on sacrifice, not transparency. And that kind of love can never last. Because real love doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't require you to disappear. Real love, true, conscious, mutual love requires your full self. And if you've spent your life hiding that self in the name of kindness, then what you've been living is not love, it's performance. So the question is, what would love look like if you no longer feared being seen as too much, too needy, too sensitive, too honest, too self-aware? What if you believed that your limits were not flaws, but sacred instructions? What if you honored your energy the way you honor others' needs? Imagine how different your relationships would be. Imagine how different you would feel. Because here's the truth. Boundaries don't push people away. They reveal who's actually willing to stay. And that's the test most of us are afraid to take. Because we've built our identities around being needed, not being known. Around being liked, not being respected. But the moment we stop apologizing for our needs, when we stop treating self-care like a betrayal, we begin to attract a different kind of love. A love that doesn't just take, but gives back. A love that sees us, meets us, and grows with us. This is the shift from martyrdom to mastery. From being the one who always saves others to being the one who finally saves themselves. It's not easy. It requires unlearning years, sometimes decades of conditioning. It requires facing the fear that you'll lose people if you show up fully. And sometimes you do. But what you gain is infinitely more valuable. You gain peace. You gain clarity. You gain you. And in a world that constantly demands your self-abandonment, choosing yourself is not just an act of revolution. How reclaiming yourself redefines your life. There is a moment quiet, powerful, irreversible when you say no, and something inside you wakes up. Not the reactive, angry no that comes from burnout, but the sacred no. The no that emerges when you finally realize your life is not a service to others' comfort. The no that acknowledges your worth exists with or without approval. This kind of no doesn't burn bridges, it builds thresholds. It marks the line between who you've been and who you're becoming. And that's when you begin to see clearly. Kindness without limits isn't kindness, it's currency, a transaction, a way to earn a place in people's lives. But when you say no from a place of self-respect, you stop trading your energy for love. You stop sacrificing your truth for temporary peace. And for the first time, you start living, not performing. The sacred no isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's a calm refusal to betray yourself any longer. It's the moment you stop explaining your boundaries like they're crimes. It's when you stop watering relationships that only bloom when you're wilting. And yes, it's terrifying at first. Because when you've been conditioned to be agreeable, to be liked, to be useful, saying no feels like an act of war. But it's not war, it's wisdom. It's the recognition that your life is finite, your energy is sacred, and your presence is a gift, not a default. The people who truly value you won't leave when you grow. They'll rise with you, and the ones who disappear, let them. Their absence is not your loss, it's your liberation. And here's where the philosophical fire becomes undeniable. When you reclaim the power of your no, your yes becomes pure. It's no longer given out of guilt, fear, or obligation. It's offered freely, fully, with presence. You begin to give from overflow, not depletion. You help because you want to, not because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't. That's not just emotional maturity, it's existential integrity. You align with your deeper self. You stop living as a fragmented version of yourself and start embodying your wholeness. And the world begins to respond differently, because the energy of someone who knows their worth is unmistakable. It doesn't shout. It doesn't chase. It simply is, grounded, steady, unapologetically real. So I'll leave you with this. What parts of your life are you still saying yes to, even though they drain you? What relationships? What habits? What would happen if you said no, not out of anger, but out of truth? Who would you become if you no longer needed to be seen as nice and instead chose to be whole? That's the heart of it. The real kindness, the kind that changes lives, begins when it includes you. Not as an afterthought, not as a martyr, but as the first and most sacred recipient of your own love. Because when being too kind destroys you, the answer isn't to become cruel, it's to become conscious. To remember that your life matters, your voice matters, and your no might just be the most loving word you ever speak.